Okay, hey everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Social Brain. This is, I think, our fourth Patreon only episode, not quite sure. But today we're talking about evolution and development. We're sort of bringing together what we talked about in the last couple episodes to a more informal discussion. So we'll just be sort of talking, see where the conversation takes us, reflecting on what we learned from the last couple episodes, and bringing it together with stuff that we talk about on this show more generally. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it, and we'll just jump right into it. Welcome to The Social Brain. I'm Andrew.
And I'm Taylor. And this is a show where we dive into how the brain works. If you've ever wondered what's going on inside your mind, even the things that you're not even aware of, then this is the place where we can unpack that and really explore it.
So I think first, I like to think about what was your biggest aha moment, or what was like your favorite thing to learn about throughout the last couple episodes.
Yeah, that's a good one because this was really cool research, and this is a topic that I've had a lot of fascination with for a long time. Both of them, actually. I've had this really big desire to understand evolution. I have this really kind of nerdy art project that I did a while back. I had one of those printers that prints high def photos, and I had this room that had rafters on the ceiling, and I was like, you know what? I really want to know more about evolution. So I'm going to just map this thing out. And I started at the Big Bang, and I printed, I think at the end of it all, I think I had 4,500 pictures that I had printed. I had probably spent close to $1,000 in ink to create this whole thing. But I mapped out from the Big Bang to now. And I had the formation of the first galaxies, and then the formation of life, and asexual versus sexual reproduction, and then as microbial life kind of expands, and really got into all of these major extinctions that happened. I mean, when you really look at it, the fact that we're here right now is pretty crazy. There have been, I think, I can't remember off the top of my head, but close to 6 to 9 major extinction events where 90% of the species on the entire planet went extinct. And we're still kicking, right? So and a lot of that, the really interesting thing when you look at a lot of that is that those major extinction events actually kicked off a lot of the really cool evolutionary growth that happened. Right, because you have this huge swath of predators just gets wiped out. Now you have this really small 10% of life is now has free reign on the whole world, and they can find new niches and they can do new things. And so for me, this has always been something that was really interesting, and something that I fell prey to back in the day. I even have one of my early YouTube videos when I was doing my YouTube channel. I fell prey to the triune brain theory. And I think that we kind of talked about that in the evolution episode, this idea that the brain was constructed in these different evolutionary stages where you have the reptile brain, and then you have the mid limbic brain for the first mammals, and then we have this special cortex. But I mean, as you dive deeper into this, and as I really started to start listening to Paul Chiswick and Luis Puelles, and these people that do really, really interesting comparative biology work, Leah Kubritz, but they have this very different view that all vertebrates have had all of the parts of the brain since the first vertebrates, and the big difference then is how we use the brain, and I think that right there has been the most fascinating thing for me in all of this research, is that the shape that our brain takes is so experience dependent.
That's such a good point. That's so interesting. And I like to just imagine you as this all these pictures of all these thousands of animals in your house, like a conspiracy theorist drawing lines from one to another, on your wall. But no, that is awesome. I never knew that. That's really cool. No, I had a similar journey. I first got into biology before I started my college major, by reading Richard Dawkins and just being fascinated by the idea of evolution. So I was very similar. Evolution and neuroscience were always sort of tied together for me. But yeah, no, I agree about when it comes to brain evolution. That was definitely something that, the triune brain theory, it seems like there are still prominent people who kind of use it as a shorthand, like Robert
Yeah.
Sapolsky,
Mhm.
and others. I mean, one of the books on my shelf, A History of the Human Brain, he kind of uses that as a shorthand, because I do think there's something to it, right? Like when you look at the brain of a fish, right, or a reptile, you see a much smaller cortex, and a much greater proportion of the brain is brainstem and, hypothalamus, and those types of regions that are involved in kind of more bodily functions, and even like autonomic and fight or flight type of stuff. And then as you get to humans, through the course of evolution, you see more and more of the brain, the proportion of the brain is cortex. And actually, I was just reading this article this morning that was super interesting about, if you look at humans, even compared to other mammals, and even compared to chimpanzees and our closest relatives, the great apes, so chimpanzees, gorillas, bonobos, and orangutans. There's these really interesting studies where they take the cortex of each of these species, and they can like dissolve it into just the cells, right? So they can count the nuclei, so they know exactly how many cells are in the cortex. And it's super interesting because humans have uh, more cortical neurons than an elephant or than a whale, even. And that's like amazing. So they have the whale or the elephant has more neurons overall, but it's all packed into their cerebellum and their brainstem. Whereas humans, a much larger proportion of the number of neurons in our brain are packed into our cortex. So I do think there's something to that you know as we evolved, our brains devoted more and more to kind of cortical development.
That's really interesting, right? So the video that I was referring to, if you go back in my YouTube channel, it's the brain's hierarchy of needs. So it was kind of this like borrowing from Maslow, this idea of like the hierarchy of needs psychologically, but looking at like brain evolution in terms of like, okay, what was necessary for some of these animals, like you mentioned with like reptiles and things that are not very social, that don't have this kind of like long distance stuff that they do, and like memory in a certain sense. Like they have memory, it's just not the same as like us and some of these higher order mammals and things like that. The reason I left the video up is because I still think, like you mentioned, that there still is an element of the triune brain theory that still serves the purpose of understanding like what these different parts of the brain are actually responsible for, right? The part of the triune brain theory that's wrong is that it evolved in different steps, that there's like these different regions that just kind of came out of nowhere. And the reason why that's so implausible is because it's really hard to add something new to DNA. It's a lot easier to refine something that already existed in your DNA. And so, like Paul Chizik's idea of phylogenetic refinement is this idea that we already had all of these pieces, but now we're just kind of making that piece do something more elaborate, right? We're using it more. And something that really kind of struck me, and the reason I left my video up, was because I still believe in the fact that like the lower parts of our brain, the brainstem, all of these things are very responsible for like the lower ends of the hierarchy of needs, right? It's like it's taking care of our need for thirst and for hunger, and you have stuff there that's the first signals for safety as you kind of move up, right? But then when you get to some of this midbrain stuff, some of this emotional stuff, you have these dopamine centers, these reward centers, these things that are pushing kind of motivation towards interaction with others, towards moving towards things that aren't just food and water, right? You're moving towards social interaction, acceptance, recognition, all of these things, especially as you become a human. And then the cortex is something that allows us to really understand everything that's going on underneath, right? To really think about, okay, why is it that we have these needs for thirst and hunger? Why do we have these needs for acceptance and belonging and all of these things? And how can we use our knowledge of why we have all of those needs to then plan for the future, right? And that's where the cortex becomes really, really interesting, and human evolution in general. As we move into our next episode, is going to be all about time. Something that's amazing about being human is that we can use this cortical area that now, like Andrew said, has a lot more neurons because we've devoted so much more energy to that part of our brain because we need to use it for the things that we do as a human, that now we can see 10, 15, 100, 300 years in the future, right? There's an interesting thing we'll probably bring up next year, or next episode, next year. But that this there's a person that we're looking at right now for some of our research that said that humans are probably the only animal that understands the cause and effect of pregnancy, because there's such a lag between sex and birth, right? And so that's where I really kind of enjoyed a lot of putting this stuff together, was that like there still is this separation of function, and I think that it's very tied to kind of the needs of the organism, that like the stuff in the back needs to come first. We need to eat food, we need to have water and air and all of this stuff, and then the like self-actualization, thinking about the future, that stuff can get put on hold. I mean, go back to our stress episodes, like that's the stuff that gets shut down when we're under stress, right?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And no, I always do kind of, this is definitely a tangential point, but I always kind of take issue with that idea that other animals don't see far into the future. Because there's just, I think Andrew Huberman mentioned this, or something like this, that there's just really no way, like there's no evidence that we can point to say like, oh, they don't think about the far future. It might be that they don't act on that, or they don't have the capability to do it, and that might be unique to us. But it seems hard to establish that, especially other animals, like other primates, aren't seeing that far into the future, especially when you consider you know primates like chimpanzees, the great apes, having this very highly developed prefrontal cortex, and we know that this is so important for our future thought, with the caveat that they also don't have the brain regions required for language, which clearly is extremely important for our ability to think and just even conceptualize far into the future. So I think that's a fair point. But anyway, yeah, that's kind of tangential there. I just think it's fascinating to think about why did humans develop language? Why did we need that adaptation, or what drove that adaptation, and how did that interact with what was driving maybe our need to think about the future, our ability to conceptualize the future. Those are all those evolutionary questions that, I mean, I'm not an expert on, but it's just fascinating to consider.
And it really looks like like it's this brand new module that just, it's like the 2.0.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you add language to this system, and it's really interesting because language then integrates into all of these other systems. Like when you look, I think we're planning on doing a whole episode about language, but you look at this work by Andrew Huth, or Alexander Huth, that shows that like language is everywhere in the brain. Like you can find evidence for certain like perceptions of words and actions and all of these things in motor cortex and somatosensory cortex and auditory cortex and visual cortex, like all of these different places. And so it shows that like once we developed this ability to start thinking symbolically, we were able to back propagate that to like all of these other regions. We were able to say, okay, now let's just like add this new module onto everything else. And now we can turn visual perceptions into language. We can turn auditory perceptions into language and somatosensory. And it creates this whole new map, this whole new like lexicon, right? That allows us to travel in a different space, right? Because I think that a lot of what came out of the evolution episode is that a lot of evolution is pushed by the need to move, right? We need to move through space. We need to get things. We need to get water. We need to secure resources for ourselves. But now when you add language on top of that, now we're moving through conceptual space, right? And it's still a type of movement, but now it's kind of like a movement through planning space. And then all of a sudden our working memory capacity just like blows up as humans.
Yeah, that is so cool. The language, I mean, is definitely distributed throughout the brain. It's not just one region. I remember talking to Gregory Hickok, who has this model of language in the brain with David Popple, and they're both big in the neuroscience of language. And the idea that there's these multiple streams of processing for language. So just as we have the kind of what and where streams for vision and for audition, for other sensory perceptual faculties, we also have something similar for language. And I wonder, if that's a general kind of feature of the brain, where we have these multiple processing streams, and then language, once it was developed, sort of tapped into that in the way that you were describing. Like, it seems like the brain is kind of, in a lot of ways, like an integrating system. Like it's all kind of working together to do one thing or do various things. And so, like, once you have a new module like language, it can integrate that into many different brain areas, can kind of work together to integrate that into the rest of cognition.
So there's also some really interesting evidence for the integration thing that you're talking about from brain computer interfacing. So they showed these studies. So if you put these chips in someone's head, like right now, like Neuralink is big or whatever. This was back with some of the first ones. These big arrays that they would plug like into the motor cortex or something. And it takes a lot of training for the person to like try to move the robot arm, and then they have to decode those signals and then turn it into a movement. But as soon as the participant starts to notice that their thoughts are moving this robot hand, all of a sudden they started to notice that the neurons themselves were like wiring themselves to the device to give the device a better signal, right? And so it kind of plugs into what you were saying. Like, all of a sudden there's this new module, which is like a chip embedded in your head that the brain is automatically trying to integrate itself with, right? And it comes back to like the stuff that David Eagleman talks about, where like the brain doesn't see or hear or touch or any of these things. All the brain has is electrical impulses, and it's trying to understand these patterns of responses. I mean, when you look at it evolutionarily, we talked about these like first neural nets from these like jellyfish that were basically just trying to like coordinate this movement, right? And then you have these like very simple sensory things that start to come online, where like all those neurons are doing is tying a time thing to something happening in the outside world. But now we have this like really complex brain that's able to tie together so many different sensory streams. And I've talked about it, like when we talk about attention and all of these things, how incredible it is that we have like billions of bits of information coming into our brain at any given time. Like right now, your brain is processing all of the things that you're not thinking about. I'm going to mention your toe right now. You feel it now because I just said it, but you didn't a second ago, right? Your brain was still bringing that in, and it's still integrating all of this stuff and then painting this like this holistic, unified picture for you. That's incredible. I mean, think about sound, right? Sound is this complex pressure wave in the air. And that would be really simple to think about if that pressure wave was just one sound. But that pressure wave is a bunch of different sounds all combined together. It's the sound of my computer humming. It's the air conditioner. It's clicking in the background. It's someone walking down the hall. All of those things are in that same waveform that's hitting your ear. And somehow your brain, with just those electrical signals, is able to isolate where in that wave the different sources of the sound came from. Right. I mean, incredible. And it really kind of highlights this fact that I mentioned being the thing that I like most about, especially the evolution part of what we did this last month, was the fact that what your brain ends up looking like is so experience dependent, because it's making sense of those signals that it's interacting with most often, right? The work that they do with like the motor cortex, with these like all across the animal kingdom, they do this comparative evolutionary biology work where they look at the representation in the motor cortex. And I don't know how many of you listening have heard of the homunculus, but the homunculus is basically this idea that we have a map of our body. Somatosensory, which is touch, right? So we have a map of like all of the different parts of our body where we get touch. But we have another one that's for motor. That's kind of a mirror, not exactly a mirror, but they're very disproportional. The part for our hands is huge because we use our hands a lot. And the part for our back is really small, right? I can touch like 2 points on your finger really close to one another, and you can distinguish that those are separate points. But if I do that exact same distance on your back, you can't tell that those are different points. It feels like I'm pushing the same spot, right? And when you look across animals, the shape of representation is different depending on what they use. So you have like a monkey that uses its tail for stabilization while it's eating, has this huge representation for tail, right? You have this other one that mainly uses like its nose for foraging, has this huge representation for nose. And that's really driven the shape of the brain over evolution. And that's why we talked about there being like different sizes of the regions, not different regions, but different sizes. You have some animals that the entire brain is like cerebellum. And it's because movement is really, really important to that animal.
Right. And there's this kind of like interaction always between, you know, the genes and the experience, the genes and the environment, the nature and nurture, in the sense that, you know, it makes sense to think about genes sort of driving predispositions to engage in certain kinds of behaviors that then,
Yeah.
as you were just describing, drive the development of what the brain ultimately ends up looking like. Right. And even with, so like with monkeys, the way you were talking about it, like, of course, the monkey's genes code for a tail to you know, grow, and then also there's probably some innate wiring there to use that tail for stabilizing on a tree and stuff. But then as it uses that over in time and learns more and more, its brain, especially like its motor cortex and its sensory cortex, are going to come to be even more emphasizing that tail region. Yeah. And similarly in humans, like if you look at the individual level, right, somebody who has a predisposition or just a strong interest in learning, I don't know, to play the piano, right, their brain may already have that sort of innate or what, you know, however it came about, but some sort of predisposition to playing the piano or to music or to, you know, dexterous fingers or something. And then as time goes on and they express that more and more, that comes to drive what the development of their brain looks like over time. They're going to have more, you know, fine or bigger representations for their fingers and for areas related to processing music and audition and stuff like that. So I just find that fascinating, that interaction between nature and nurture. It's a lot of people want to think of it one way or the other, but there's always that interaction. You can't get away from that.
No, and this, I mean, I think this really allows us to kind of tie in some of these developmental pieces that we talked about, right? Because what you just mentioned is huge, right? Like, really think about this. The fact that someone who plays piano their whole life will actually have increased cortical thickness and a larger representation in their motor cortex for their fingers. Like, they have a different experience of using their hands than someone that does not play piano, because they have such fine acuity and all of these things. Like, someone who plays violin will have a certain kind of representation just on kind of the opposite side of their dominant hand that they use for the bow, right? They have a very different one for the fingers that they're pushing the strings on, and a different representation for the bow because they're different movements and different things, right? So it highlights this fact that as you engage in something, as you devote your attention to something, it literally changes your brain. And I think that that's really important to highlight as we kind of link these concepts to development, right? Because there was a reason why we focused on adolescence, right? We could have just done brain development, but then that would have been like all over the place, right? Adolescence was such a cool period because it's the point in time in which the brain is starting to specialize on all of those things that are experience dependent, right? So we're looking at like these experiences are shaping things evolutionarily. You can see this across species and everything, but it's also happening at the individual level over development as you engage in something. What's really cool about being human is that we engage in thousands of activities, right? Most animals have a pretty routine spectrum of things that they do, right? There's not like a chimp that plays piano and a chimp that plays saxophone and like, or one that plays soccer versus, right? Like, there's so many different types of motor things that we can engage in as humans that shape our brains in very different ways. I think that's...
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this episode of The Social Brain. If you're watching or hearing this right now, it means you're on the public feed. If you want to see the rest of this episode where we discuss more, go to our Patreon, go to patreon.com/thesocialbrain and sign up for, I think it's the premium tier where you'll get access to these episodes, but that'll all be detailed on patreon.com/thesocialbrain. definitely check it out. We really appreciate any form of support, but we especially appreciate if you are able to contribute, and we show that appreciation by having these exclusive episodes. So definitely